Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for EMBCA's The Hellenic Revolution and its effects on the American women's suffrage movement in association with AHEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission. My name is Luke Katsos, president of EMBCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance, and chairman of AHEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by EMBCA's executive vice president, Marina Belessis Casoria, and our distinguished panel includes Congresswoman Caroline Maloney, a great American Philhellenic woman known to all of us, and co-chair of the Hellenic Congressional Caucus. Professor Maureen Santelli of North Virginia Community College, author of The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions, and Professor Angelo Repousis of Villanova University, author of Greek-American Relations from Monroe to Truman. Congresswoman Maloney had to attend some important issues in Congress today, but she sent us a video with her greetings and presentations for this special occasion. As mentioned previously in various EMBCA panel discussions, this discussion will be a further expansion of my and Professor Nicholas Alexiou's lectures over 2 years ago entitled Contributions of African Americans in the Hellenic Revolution of 1821 and Early American Philhellenes Ushering the Abolitionist Movement and Suffrage Movements, a topic that at the time on the revolution was rarely discussed. And also as well on our panel discussion in December of last year entitled Hellenic Philhellenic Women and Their Effects on the Hellenic Revolution. In that event, which Marina moderated and included among others as panelists, both the Congresswoman Maloney and Professor Santelli, we were cited for it in the congressional record. Due to the importance of both the Hellenic Revolution's effects on the American abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement, however, we felt it was very important to have 2 additional panel discussions around these historic movements. The first we had in February of this year with EMBCA's The Hellenic Revolution, its effects on the American abolitionist movement and beyond, panel discussion. And the second will be today's The Hellenic Revolution and its effects on the American women's suffrage movement. During the women's suffrage centennial from 1920 to 2021, and the Hellenic Revolution BiCentennial from 1821 to this year, EMBCA, the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance, reflects, honors, and celebrates our foremothers and women's heroic achievements in freedom and democracy. We celebrate the contributions of American Philhellenic women to the Hellenic revolutionary cause and their courageous activism in the women's suffrage rights movement. American Philhellenic women included a who's who of the women's suffrage movement, and they included, among many others, Julia Ward Howe, Emma Willard, Lucy Stone, Eliza Snow, Elizabeth Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and many others, The significant linkages of Philhellenic women to the American suffrage and women's rights movement are not only missing pieces of American and Hellenic histories, but missing in many ways also in women's history. The American Philhellenic movement sparked outrage within the United States for the enslavement of the Christian Hellenes, leading to an outcry of public support, not only initially for the Greek cause, but over time and generationally, the causes of anti-slavery, abolition, and women's rights in our American democracy. The Philhellenic movement's popular political rhetoric was adopted by American women and men for public awakening, political awareness, and engagements on women's rights to property, wages, voting, and the overall status of women. The Greek Revolution was truly transformative as it championed revolution from tyranny and slavery in both Greece and America. Greek committees were established in many cities, and substantial private contributions were given for the aid of Hellenes, which included food, clothing, medicine, saving thousands of lives. Humanitarian relief from the American Philhellenic Greek committees sent shiploads with desperately needed supplies. One second. Forming grassroots social and religious groups for the Greek cause. Women through Greek committees spread the Greek fever or the Greek fire in humanitarian activism, fundraising, philanthropy, and leadership. Philhellenic political activism led them through the Greek cause to also question women's issues, citizenship rights, freedoms, and their public role in the world, seeking to become active stakeholders in the American political franchise. It's a fascinating story of a catalytic transformation in women's rights, due in part to the Philhellenic American women's active participation in the Hellenic Revolution. It is the hope, as with other groundbreaking events we have had, that this panel discussion will help develop a greater understanding of both the Philhellenic movement and the women's rights movement during the concurrent celebrations of the Hellenic Revolution BiCentennial and the Women's Suffrage Centennial. We hope also that it encourages further research on this very important topic, as well as generating books, research papers, and activities around the subject. This event and others we have had and are being planned are part of EMBCA's American Hellenic Revolution of 1821 Bicentennial Committee series of events, focusing not only on the Hellenic Revolution, but also importantly on the American diaspora and international aspects and influences of the revolution for its 200th year anniversary. It is now my pleasure to introduce EMBCA's Executive Vice President and panel moderator, Marina Belessis Casoria. Marina is the president of the Ideas Unlimited and a creative development consultant at the intersection of strategy, programming, resource development, and communications for organizations dedicated to driving social good, philanthropy, and impact investing. She is a certified fundraising executive international in fundraising and management with over 20 years of experience in working with the community-based organizations, philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, and strategic partnership. Marina served as a member of the public affairs team at Con Edison, managing corporate social responsibility, strategic partnerships, government relations, community relations, emergency management, and public affairs. She is the founding board member of ELPIDES, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence, and her corporate service included membership to the board of directors for Opportunities for a Better Tomorrow, Dodge YMCA, Brooklyn Center for Performing Arts at Brooklyn College, and Hope Program Business Advisory Council. She is the founder of Helios Project, whose mission is advocacy, community relations, and development initiatives in response to humanitarian and refugee crisis in Greece, Cyprus, Lebanon, Jordan, Serbia, Turkey via leadership, development, and community engagement. Marina.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Lou. I know Congresswoman Maloney couldn't be here today due to her responsibilities in Washington, but I'd like to introduce her presentation to us, which I think you'll be very happy to see. New York City has no stronger advocate in Congress than Congresswoman Maloney. She represents the 12th congressional district located in New York City, which is most of the east side of Manhattan, Roosevelt Island, the East River, across to Queens, Astoria, Long Island City, parts of Woodside, Brooklyn, including Greenpoint. She is a recognized progressive national leader with extensive accomplishments on financial services, national security, the economy, and women's issues. She is currently the chairwoman of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. She is a senior member and former chair of the Joint Economic Committee, and she is the first to hold that position, actually both positions. The career of Congresswoman Maloney has been a series of firsts. She is the first woman representing the 12th Congressional District, the first woman to represent the 7th District, and the first woman to give birth while in office. Only 18 women in history have chaired the congressional committees that Congresswoman in Congress. Maloney is the author of Rumors of Our Progress Have Been Greatly Exaggerated, Why Women's Lives Aren't Getting Any Easier, and How We Can Make Real Progress for Ourselves and Our Daughters, which has been used as a textbook in women's studies courses. She is the lead House sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. In exactly 1921, 100 years ago, the suffragists set their sights on another constitutional change after winning the right to vote. It wasn't enough for them. They knew we needed to put gender equality into our Constitution. And so these women, among them Congresswoman Maloney's relative, Alice Paul, who's a very famous suffragette, wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. She is the author of the Smithsonian Women's History Museum Act, which was recently signed into law in celebration of Women's History Month. Congresswoman Maloney is the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Hellenic Issues. The caucus serves to bring a renewed congressional focus on key diplomatic, military, and human rights issues in this critical part of the world. The members of the Hellenic Caucus introduce legislation, arrange briefings on current events, and disseminate information to interested parties about the Hellenic Republic and issues of the Eastern Mediterranean. She represents Astoria, one of the largest Hellenic diaspora populations in the world, and is a steadfast supporter of strong US relations with Greece and Cyprus. Congresswoman Maloney is a great American Philhellenic woman whose celebrated leadership earned her the nickname of America's Bubulina, after a heroine of the Hellenic Revolution for her fierce championship of Hellenic and American virtues and values. We thank her for her leadership and championship of issues of concern to the Hellenic American community, her efforts to protect Greek heritage and the return of the Parthenon marbles, her support of the ecumenical patriarchate of the Greek Orthodox Church as a champion of human rights and religious freedom, and human rights are women's rights. Her efforts to stop illegal Turkish violations of international law and incursions into Greece, the Aegean, and East Mediterranean, and her efforts to find a viable and lasting settlement to the long-standing invasion and illegal occupation of Cyprus. She is loved and admired for her commitment and leadership for Hellenic and American values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and peace. So why don't we play her video?
Thank you to the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance for organizing this great event. And thank you to EMBCA, President Lou Katsos, and Executive Vice President Marina Belessis Casoria for having me today, and I'm really looking forward to when we can be in person together again. As a member of EMBCA's American Hellenic Revolution BiCentennial Celebration Committee, I'm excited to speak on the Hellenic Revolution and its effect on the American women's suffrage movement, and to update you all on some of the work we're doing in Congress. As we commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence, it is incumbent upon all of us to honor the legacies of these women and recognize how their actions influence the relationship between the United States and Greece. I have the unique privilege of representing one of the largest and most dynamic Greek American communities in the United States, in Astoria, Queens, and I am blessed to call many of them close friends. My constituents inspired me to co-found and co-chair the Congressional Caucus on Hellenic Issues in 1996. With more than 110 members from both parties, it is one of the most active and bipartisan caucuses in the House. And I'm especially honored that my friends in the Hellenic community have bestowed me with the nickname Bouboulina, after Bouboulina, one of the many great warriors of the Greek War of Independence, and whose home I had the privilege of visiting in 2016. Bouboulina was a trailblazer in her own right and committed herself to the cause of a free and independent Greek state. And I do not take my nickname for granted. Bouboulina spent her life fighting for Greece, and rest assured, I will always fight on your behalf as your Philhellene in Congress. As the birthplace of democracy, Greece was an inspiration for the U.S. system of government. And just as Greece inspired our country, our revolution helped inspire the Greeks to revolt against the Ottomans. So it should come as no surprise that when the Greek War of Independence started, American Philhellenes and Greek American communities in the U.S. not only voiced their support for the cause, but actively supported their campaign. These American Philhellenes included Presidents Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, and other distinguished leaders like General Lafayette, William Townsend Washington, and Daniel Webster. It is only just a few degrees of separation to connect the Greek War of Independence to the modern-day fight for women's equality here in the United States and abroad. Most notably, many of the American Philhellenes supporting the Greek War of Independence included future leaders of the women's suffrage and abolitionist movements. As American women became involved in the effort, they connected the battle against Greek slavery under the Ottoman Empire with other female-led reform movements. Over time, their participation grew into an international movement, expanding female participation in the public sphere for both American and Greek women. Emma Willard, who formed the Troy Society for the Advancement of Female Education in Greece, was one of the most outspoken advocates for the education of women. Sarah Arms Miller was involved in the women's suffrage movement and supported the Underground Railroad. She and her husband adopted an Hellenic orphan of the Revolution, Lucas Miltiades Miller, who later became the first Greek American to serve in Congress. Trailblazers like Bouboulina, Willard, and Miller, who toppled their oppressors, demanded equality, and fought to enact change to benefit future generations of women, inspire my work in Congress every day. I have tried to live up to their legacy by fighting for women's equality. When it comes to basic inclusion in our democracy, I have long fought for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Ratifying the ERA and finally getting it into the U.S. Constitution is such a basic act, but has been a long battle to get. Fortunately, we are nearly there. Again, this Congress, the House, passed a bill that would eliminate the arbitrary time limit on the ERA and help get it certified once and for all. I am also pushing the National Archivist to do his job. Count the additional 3 states that have ratified it in the modern era, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, and certify the amendment once and for all. In truth, there should be no deadline on equality. I have also long fought to eliminate violence against women in our country, for equal pay for equal work, to provide parental leave for all workers, and for reproductive freedom. As chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, I held a hearing on March 24th, Equal Pay Day, with soccer star Megan Rapinoe to highlight the huge pay discrepancies that still exist between men and women, even for the exact same work. I plan to continue using my position as chair to highlight important issues we must address to finally achieve equality. My bill to create a Smithsonian Museum dedicated to telling American women's history in our nation's capital was signed into law late last year. It's an incredible moment that was decades in the making. Finally, a Smithsonian Women's History Museum will be situated on or near the National Mall and give women our rightful place in history. Can you believe that? The U.S. has no comprehensive museum celebrating the contributions of women throughout history. So now we are making history by celebrating history. The example set by Hellenic and Philhellenic women during the Greek War of Independence exemplifies the U.S.-Greece relationship that thrives to this day. It is because of our historic friendship and shared commitment to liberal democratic values that the U.S. and Greece continue to work on so many issues that have a profound effect on the world. From issues like energy, the economy, and trade, to national security, I am committed to doing everything possible to constantly strengthen and improve what is already one of our country's most important alliances. With the support of friends here and across the Hellenic community, I continue to spearhead initiatives in Congress to show U.S. support for Greece. I have reintroduced a resolution supporting the return of the Parthenon marbles back to Greece where they belong, and continue to defend the ecumenical patriarch from discrimination. I recently introduced a bill, the Turkey and Ecumenical Patriarch Religious Freedom Act of 2021, to hold Turkey accountable for violating the religious freedoms of the ecumenical patriarch, Greek Orthodox Christians, and other religious minorities. I've also led letters to the State Department urging them to go further and hold Turkey accountable for its illegal campaign of aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean and violations of Greek sovereignty. While the work never ends, I'm proud to say that since the Hellenic Caucus was formed, we've prevented any legislation from passing Congress that could threaten the U.S.-Greece relationship. As your ally in Congress, I promise that Greece and the Hellenic community can be sure that those of us who are proud to call ourselves your friends will always be there for you. So thank you again for having me, and thank you for highlighting the important connection between the Hellenic Revolution and today's continued efforts to achieve women's equality here at home and abroad. Thank you.
That was great, by the way.
Congresswoman Maloney did a great job. She always does. She's a champion. So now our next presenter will be Dr. Maureen Santelli. She is a historian and author of the newly published book by Cornell University Press, The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions. Professor Santelli teaches at Northern Virginia Community College, where she is a full-time faculty member teaching survey courses in American history, Western civilization, and the ancient world. Her research brings together her expertise in classical history with global history during the era of the early American Republic. Her book examines how American popular support for the Greek War of Independence during the 1820s and 1830s developed into a practical school for political action, aiding the rise of the abolitionist movement and women's suffrage, female education, and women's rights. Her dissertation, The Greek Fire, the Greek War of Independence and Emergence of American Reform Movements from 1780 to 1860, has grown into this published book, The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions. You can read her dissertation and her articles online. Her article, Depart from that Retired Circle, Women's Support for the Greek War of Independence and Antebellum Reform in the Early American Studies Journal, is available online through JSTOR on Google. Dr. Santelli has a PhD in American history and a master's degree in American history from both the George Mason University. And she has a bachelor's in classical languages, literature and linguistics, and in history. Dr. Santelli, thank you so much for your book and for joining us today. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. I think we're going to start with, before I begin, to put the image up of the Greek slave, if we can do that just briefly. It doesn't need to be up for the entire time. Thank you. In 1847, American sculptor Hiram Power's statue, The Greek Slave, arrived in the United States. Displayed throughout the country, the sculpture provoked immense controversy wherever it was shown. In depicting a nude woman in the shackles of slavery, this one image brought together some of the most volatile issues of the day: the question of slavery, of women's rights, and of American support for Greek independence. Yet while historians have paid significant attention to the first two of these movements, slavery and women's rights, many have overlooked the importance of the third issue, the war for Greek independence, a cause that provoked significant support from women across the country. Through their participation in grassroots organizations to aid the Greeks in their war against the Muslim Turks, many women gained experience that led them to participate in other antebellum reform movements, especially abolitionism and women's rights. The origins of popular support for the Greek Revolution lie in a transatlantic movement to which American men and women felt especially connected. By the late 18th century, many people on both sides of the Atlantic were swept up in what has been called the Philhellenic movement, an intellectual trend that looked back to ancient Greece as the source of Western democracy and freedom. The nostalgic connection to Greece, combined with the fact that the modern Greeks were living under Ottoman rule, drew on nationalist pride in their own revolution in order to cultivate support for Greek independence. The United States' relationship with the Ottoman Empire played an influential and complicated role in how Americans supported the modern Greeks. A dislike and mistrust for the Muslim world was already extant within the United States by the end of the 18th century, but intensified through the Barbary Wars. Contrasting their Western classical tradition with the Muslim origins of the Ottoman Empire, Americans imagined their nation as the freest country in the world and the Ottoman Empire as the most despotic. Reformist-minded American women involved in supporting the Greek cause came to understand and articulate their own oppressed status as American citizens through the prism of the Ottoman Empire. While American Philhellenic leaders such as Edward Everett and Matthew Carey were internationally recognized for their support for the Greek Revolution, both men came to rely on the involvement of women for their organizational success. Women were able to devote themselves to the Greek cause, combining the sentimental and patriotic foundations of the Philhellenic movement with benevolence. Women directed their efforts toward aiding Greek civilians, especially women and children, through gathering supplies, clothing, and later organized efforts to recruit teachers for newly built schools in Athens. By doing this, American women hoped to return intellectual freedom to the lands of the ancient Greeks and uplift the formerly oppressed Greek women. Benevolent societies were popular among women in both the northern and southern states by the early 19th century, where dedication to Christianity and family justified participation in public life of local communities. That the Greek cause came to encompass sentimentality, humanitarianism, and patriotism made raising funds for the Greeks an activity in which women could appropriately engage. An important reason why American women were especially interested in joining the Greek cause was because of contemporary perceptions of female life in the Ottoman Empire. And I just pause for a second. In a lot of ways, the understanding of what life was like in the Ottoman Empire was driven partly by how they received their news at the time, literature, et cetera. It wasn't completely accurate, but this was their understanding of the Muslim world and the Ottoman Empire in particular. For early Americans who saw the moral stability of a nation as originating in the home with the wife and mother, the harem was viewed as the ultimate manifestation of depravity and despotism. Most Americans believed that women in these harems were literally locked up within the Sultan's palace and kept for his every erotic whim. Early advocates for women's rights, most notably Mary Wollstonecraft, frequently referred to the status of women in Islamic culture as one of complete exploitation that, quote, kills virtue and genius in the bud, end quote. According to Wollstonecraft, if women could not pursue reason and respect within society, then they would be condemned to the same kind of subjected status as Muslim women. As the American Philhellenic movement grew, ladies' groups primarily directed their efforts at gathering food and clothing for Greek civilians. For example, the ladies of Providence, Rhode Island, and the surrounding communities alone produced over 3,000 items of clothing. Even in smaller communities such as Canandaigua, New York, ladies set to work with their needles in making clothing for the Greek women and children. And there's actually lots of really great little stories about the children being actively involved in this endeavor. At least in one instance, students of the Female Academy in Lexington, Kentucky, joined the efforts of the local male college to raise funds and even issued a pamphlet titled An Address to the Young Ladies of the West, which encouraged women throughout the United States to join their efforts at raising donations. Even women of color were at least minimally involved in the Greek cause, as one paper reported that ladies and gentlemen of color in New York had given a benefit for the Greek cause. According to the report, these ladies and gentlemen were enthusiastic enough over the benefit that the company did not disperse until 6 o'clock in the morning. With enthusiasm for the welfare of modern Greek women at an apex, women began to diversify their relief efforts. With the combined cooperation of Philhellenic ladies, organizations, and missionaries, the first American-run schools in Greece were established in 1828. Education efforts in Greece were focused on moving towards the emancipation of the minds of Greece from their long bondage, as they put it. Missionaries worked in conjunction with the Ladies' Greek Committee of New York, as well as individuals such as the founder of the first female institution for higher learning in the United States, Emma Willard. Willard wrote a letter to the New York State Legislature in 1819, stating that how a nation educated its women was a reflection of how civilized the society was as a whole. From an American perspective, the Ottoman Empire was not civilized, and therefore, in order for the Greeks to become a free nation, education was key. In the midst of their reform efforts in Greece, advocates for female education reform could not help but see similar issues in their own country, where both white women and slaves were denied access to education as well. In 1833, Willard's sister, Elmira Phelps, compared those who denied education to women to Southern slaveholders, pointing out that a bill for the endowment of a female seminary was defeated by those who thought, quote, of the evils which might result from the enlightening of the minds of those who were destined to a limited and subordinate sphere. Applying her thoughts of education as being the ultimate method of enlightening any group of people, Phelps observed that, as respects the slave, this reasoning is undoubtedly correct. Let the Black population of the South be taught that they, in fact, possess the greater physical power. Let their minds be open to the truths of man's equality by nature and of the unjust tenure of their bondage. In a similar way, Willard wrote in the same year that female education in Greece was important, given that the Greek women had been slaves under Turkish rule for so long that they needed to, quote, they needed others to resuscitate the principle of life within her. When this is once effected, she will walk abroad in her own strength and provide for herself and her children. Almost 15 years later, the unveiling of Hiram Power's statue of the Greek slave brought together Philhellenic sentiments with the impulses of abolitionism and women's rights in a shocking yet powerful and persuasive new way. The image of the Greek slave forced many Americans to recall their support for the Greek Revolution, their disdain for Turkish slavery, and the status of women both at home and abroad. Where the abolitionist and women's rights movements had drawn momentum from the Greek Revolution, once again, these movements could draw momentum from the symbol of imagined Turkish oppression. Although the Greek Revolution had long since ended, the discourse denouncing Turkish enslavement of the Greeks had not disappeared. Moreover, by 1847, American men and women, primarily in the North, had become increasingly hostile to the institution of slavery in their own country. Many Americans viewed the Greek slave as an image that highlighted the degree to which American society fell short of their own ideal. One abolitionist periodical referred to the statue as an impersonification of slavery and was the counterpart of thousands of living women residing especially in the American South. Frederick Douglass's paper captured this sentiment best in a review of the statue. The reviewer described the statue in great detail and offered emotional reaction to seeing the innocent young girl in chains. Now, maybe we again could put the image up on the screen for a second as I read this review, if that's okay. Oh, there we go. The first one, the Greek slave again. My apologies.
That's Zenobia.
There we go. So here's what the reviewer had to say. How heart and brain burn with hatred for the cruel Turk who does thus violate the sacred rights of human nature. And to this feeling heart and discerning eye, all slave girls are Greek and all slave mongers Turk. Wicked, cruel, and hateful be their names. Their country Algiers or Alabama, Congo or Carolina, the same. If the Turkish owner of this young Greek girl was cruel and despotic, then so too was any individual who stole away the innocence and freedom of another. For American women especially, the Greek slave resonated with their own legal status as well as the status of slaves. The image of the slave as a symbol of lost personhood was especially powerful for women in the antebellum era, as it represented to them a lack of legal control over their bodies. That the Greek slave depicted a nude Christian female with no control over her sexuality, let alone her future, was an association not lost on American women. For example, in 1851, when the Greek slave was on exhibition in Boston, Lucy Stone, a budding abolitionist at the time, visited the exhibit. Upon seeing the statue, Stone was struck by how emblematic of women the statue was, with fettered hands and half-averted face. Viewing Power's statue was one of the most momentous events in Stone's life, as it influenced her to expand her reform interests and began speaking on women's issues. Some reformist-minded women used the Greek slave and the rhetoric of the Greek cause as a medium for political statement. A contemporary of Hiram Powers was Harriet Hosmer, an American female sculptor that endeavored to convey a message of anti-slavery and pro-women's rights through her art. As Hosmer's notoriety as a female artist rose, she attracted the attention of female abolitionists and women's rights advocates, including Lydia Maria Child, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Frances Dana Barker, and Lucy Stone. Only in her early 20s at the time, Hosmer produced an artistic critique of Power's Greek slave. Hosmer was, with the encouragement of both Child and Stone, endeavored to produce a statue of a woman that, unlike the Greek slave, would depict a strong woman that reflected resolute defiance toward her male captors. Hosmer's statue depicted Zenobia, and if we can put up the second image now, if that's okay. Zenobia, the queen of the Greek kingdom Palmyra, who was enslaved by the Romans in 274 CE. For Hosmer and the women's rights advocates who supported her work, Zenobia in Chains represented a more aggressive and publicly visible approach to women's reform. With Power's Greek slave as an inspiration and motivation, Hosmer diligently gathered the advice of her female supporters and created a statue that combined women's rights and abolitionism. One of Hosmer's most famous supporters was English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote a poem about the Greek slave while it was on display at the Crystal Palace in England. In her poem, Browning criticized the paradoxical placidness of Power's statue, but reminded her readers that the Greek slave's message was not merely of Turkish oppression, but a reminder of the existence of oppression in their own country. Browning's criticism of Power's statue as being too passive likely influenced Hosmer's decisions on Zenobia. Lydia Maria Child also suggested that Hosmer's statue portray a strong rather than weak woman. Child wrote many reviews of Hosmer's work, praising her artistic abilities as a female artist. Child's review of Zenobia in Chains highlighted its differences from Power's statue. The expression of the beautiful face is admirably conceived. It is sad, but calm and very proud. The expression of a great soul, whose regal majesty no misfortune could dethrone. Like Browning, Child disagreed with Power's depiction of a subdued, weak, and demure woman, and preferred that such a female figure should stand resolute and determined. Hosmer wrote Child specifically addressing this aspect of the statue, explaining, "I have tried to make her too proud to exhibit passion or emotion of any kind, not subdued, though a prisoner, but calm, grand, and strong within herself." Where Power's statue represented a Philhellenic and abolitionist icon with a powerless woman in need of rescue, Hosmer's statue represented the aspirations of the women's rights movement. For the women who collaborated on Zenobia, the symbol of women's rights would not passively accept subjugation and slavery like Power's Greek slave, but should rather defy it. Throughout the 19th century, women's rights advocates, including suffragettes, used the rhetoric of the Greek cause, drawing similar comparisons to the condition of women in the United States and the Muslim world. Writing a history of the women's suffrage movement in the 1880s, authors Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage quipped in their preface that their object in writing their history was to, quote, make it an arsenal of facts for those who are beginning to inquire into the demands and arguments of the leaders of this reform. Among these facts throughout their 3-volume work include comparisons to slavery elsewhere in the world to the condition of women in the United States. American men may quiet their consciences with the delusion that no such injustice exists in this country as in Eastern nations, scoffed the suffragettes. Yet the same principle that degrades her in Turkey insults her in this republic. Qualifying the statement, Stanton continued that custom forbids a woman there to enter a mosque or call the hour of prayers. Here, it forbids her voice in church councils or state legislatures. The same taint of her primitive state of slavery affects both latitudes. Although the Philhellenic movement in the United States initially aimed at helping the Greeks as an extension of philanthropic relief abroad, ironically, in the end, it transformed American society. Both the rhetoric of the Greek cause and participation in the movement influenced the participants, inspiring them to bring attention to abolition and women's rights through a global lens. Though the consensus among Philhellenic organizations of the early 1820s was short-lived, and not all supporters went on to become radical advocates of abolition and women's rights, the memory of the Greek cause continued to play a pivotal role in American reform through the 19th and into the early 20th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Santelli.
Yeah.
Our next presenter is Dr. Angelo Repousis. He is a specialist in U.S. diplomatic history.
Okay, so can I just get the PowerPoint up and I'll just read my presentation.
Oh, Dr. Repousis, I wanted to continue. Professor
I'm sorry.
Repousis has held.
I thought there was a pause there. I thought you were.
I'm sorry. I thought I was muted. I apologize. Professor Repousis has held teaching positions at Villanova University, Westchester University, Temple University, and other Greater Philadelphia universities. He is an author of Greek-American Relations from Monroe to Truman, which examines the relations with the Greek nation, which has loomed large in the American imagination, published by Kent State University Press and part of the New Studies in U.S. Foreign Relations series. Thank you, Dr. Repousis.
Okay, I'd like to just continue some of the discussion that Maureen was talking about, and focusing primarily on Emma Willard's efforts to found the Troy Female Seminary in Athens. And if I could just have the PowerPoint, and you can just read along with me. Willard was the principal and founder of the Troy Female Seminary, which was founded in 1821, which was the first institution of higher learning for women in the United States. And her sister Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps were instrumental in forming again a female society to collect subscriptions for the Greeks again during the Greek Revolution. And besides the Troy Society, enthusiasts formed ladies' auxiliaries in other parts of the country, including places like New York City, Baltimore, New Haven, and other towns. And in 1833, Willard embarked on an ambitious campaign to establish in Greece a female seminary to train women teachers. And the question of female education in Greece offered Willard a forum to enter into a much broader debate on the subject of women's rights, both at home and abroad. And just a little kind of footnote here, the prevailing view of education, particularly in female education, was that too much education would spoil women. It would make them unfit for marriage. And Willard and many others like her hoped to change that narrative. Willard believed that the nation's future prosperity rested upon the character of its citizens, characters which would be formed by American mothers. So this idea of Republican virtue, that the success of the Republic, and this is a nation or a country of, by, for the people, it was important that, again, the character or the virtue of the citizenry was paramount. And so who better, again, to help raise the next generation of virtuous Republican citizens, but women, in their fulfilling their duties as wives and mothers. But it also stood to reason that for women to fulfill this mission of good Republican wives and mothers, that they needed to be educated themselves. And for Willard, women's uplift and the improved status of women marked the degree of civilization reached by society as a whole. We wish, Willard wrote, to educate Grecian girls that they may hereafter give a good impulse to their sons as well as their daughters. Her efforts to uplift her sisters in Greece mirrored the commitment of Protestant missionary societies to reform the ancient Greek church and to bring American Protestant-style civilization to the land of Homer and Plato. Women missionaries in Greece, including one of Willard's former students, likewise identified their Greek sisters burdened by excessive childbirth and enveloped in layers of restrictive clothing as suitable targets for an American educational and religious imperialism. In one of her letters to Willard, again, Frances Hill, who was the wife of John Hill, one of the missionaries that was sent out by the Episcopalians during this period, wrote that, again, as soon as they find a man whom they think suitable, the girl is offered to him, and what they can give her is told him. So she's literally saying here that, again, that women as infants are betrothed at infancy, and again, making this connection that they are being treated like they were property, slaves, if you will, that they are being sold again to men. And so Willard became one of the first to use this rhetoric of social uplift, Christianity, and civilization to extend women's public activity onto the international stage. Following the conclusion of the Greek Revolution, Philhellenes made several attempts to promote common school education in Greece. Earlier in 1831, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of the Protestant Episcopal Church established a mission in Athens under the charge of Reverends John J. Robertson of Baltimore and John Henry Hill of Virginia. And the rapid growth and success of the Athens mission in turn created a pressing need for qualified instructors. And to this end, Hill and Robertson turned to Willard for help. Robertson visits, again, Willard in 1832. His wife was one of Willard's former students. And he hoped to impress upon her the urgency of, again, establishing a school to train women teachers. So for Willard, education represented the means to equip women to fulfill their mission of raising the moral standard of the nation and ultimately the world. Her goal was not merely to prepare mothers, but teachers who via the classroom would project their influence over the nation as a whole. Her motives went beyond simply educating Greek women. It involved nationalism, imperialism of a nascent form, and Protestant missionary impulses, as well as a burgeoning feminism. So what is interesting about her campaign is the frequent use of gendered imagery to depict the Greeks as both figurative women and children, seemingly unable to care for themselves and in need of guidance. And this metaphor had figured prominently in the discussions of Greece during the Greek Revolution, where the country was depicted as a woman in distress, a victim of Turkish brutality. John Randolph of Virginia, when the Greek women were making garments for the Greeks, pointed to long gangs of black slaves and said, quote, "Ladies, the Greeks are at your doors." And so her plea drew attention to the sad plight of Greek women, still, quote, "wandering with their helpless offspring over the devastated hills of their now barren country. Greek females," she added, "still suffered under the yoke of the, quote, vilest slavery, which considered them the property of men. And far from thinking of cultivating their minds," Willard lamented, "men here forget or deny that they possess them. And how then can we but feel for the misery and degradation of our own sex?" Again, she mused. And Willard could also have been speaking about the condition of women in the United States at that time. It is notable that Willard would use the terms like slave and slavery to describe the plight of her Greek sisters. Since the 18th century, Greek exoticism had served as a shorthand for enslavement, and modern Greece was often portrayed in both literature and art as a woman in chains. Her sister, Elmira Phelps, remarked that women in this delightful region has ever been degraded when we reflect on the abuses of the virtuous of our sex, holding them in intellectual bondage. So the women in bondage analogy, for one, typically presumed that only Western men were capable of breaking the chains of female Greece, since Greek men were considered too debased to aid in their own regeneration. But now Willard and friends were proposing that American women, in introducing female education in Greece, were the only means of civilizing the Eastern men. And the Troy women may have been using this critique of the enslavement of Greek women as a veiled critique of their own enslavement as wives. And the Troy women could empathize with their Greek sisters because they, as women, faced a similar oppression due to their sex. Phelps could also have been talking about American women when she used the analogy of the Trojan Andromache, who, like the Greek matron, was, quote, "commanded by her lord to guide the spindle and direct the loom, not dreaming that she had an intellect to improve or a soul to save." Phelps also challenged the romantic idealization of the Greek past shared by her male contemporaries. And it's important to note that it's during this period where we see again the popularity of the Greek revival in architecture. The Second Bank of the United States, here in Old City, Philadelphia, for example, which began construction in 1818 and was completed in 1824 during the Greek Revolution, was modeled after the Parthenon. And so there was this sense among American Philhellenes that they were recreating Periclean Athens, this again in democracy. So Willard and again her female contemporaries, including her sister, shared this commitment to recreate Periclean Athens in the, quote, woods of America, but their vision of a brighter Hellas would include the women. Indeed, when looking back to the glorious days of the Grecian Republic, Phelps wrote, again, we see a gloomy picture of Greece's condition, more gloomy because there was light around her, and yet she was in darkness. While the great and noble men of ancient Greece cultivated a taste for all that was exquisite and beautiful in nature and art, they wholly overlooked her who might by her smiles have encouraged and by her taste improved their labors of art and their efforts in literature. So this could be seen as also kind of a veiled critique by criticizing ancient Greek society and culture as being oppressive to women. They were also, again, perhaps drawing attention to their own, again, oppressed status here in the United States. considering again the reverence that many again intellectuals had toward ancient Greek culture and history. The democratization of American politics and the spread of Greek-themed architecture both gave the impression to many that a brighter Hellas was beginning anew in America. But as Phelps implies, such brightness would likewise dim if proper care and support were not given to women who she calls the true Corinthian pillars of society. And as I mentioned, when one considers the reverence for ancient Greece as the birthplace of Western and American civilization, any challenge to that classical tradition was nothing short of incendiary. Some of Willard's critics would refer to her as a woman who had violated the decencies of her sex. Again, one wrote that she has, like another Helen, violated the decencies of her sex, and they would bring up other classical Greek women like Aspasia, who was the consort of Pericles, who was an educated and liberated woman, as someone who had overstepped their traditional boundaries and sought to leave the female sphere. And so Willard is saying here that, hey, we're not exactly Aspasia, but we're not Andromache either. And so she was very quick to point out that, again, we still seek to lean on the arm of the stronger sex. But yet in her, again, private correspondence and in her rhetoric, make no mistake that she was, again, the leader of the movement, and she would not take a back seat. So Phelps, while emphasizing that with the fate of with the fate of Andromache, was also quick to criticize the Sapphos and Aspasias of ancient Greece, who, while throwing off their chains, lived to disgrace the, quote, delicacies of their sex by becoming the rival of the other sex. Nevertheless, there were also times when the Troy women were straightforward in their feminism. In her appeal on behalf of female education in Greece, read before a congregation at St. John's Church, an appeal that was actually read or delivered by a man. So Willard, even though she wrote this appeal, it was considered taboo for a woman to get up and speak before a mixed audience of men and women. So she would have her appeal read by a man. But in her appeal on behalf of female education, she proclaimed that justice will yet be done. Woman will have her rights. I see it in the course of events. And so for both symbolic and humanitarian reasons, the promotion of a female seminary in Greece offered Willard a unique opportunity to realize that goal. And the irony could not have been lost on Willard's detractors, who saw a woman succeed in establishing a school on the haunted and holy ground of Athens, where their male contemporaries had actually failed. And Willard had developed a vast network of her former students all across the country, and she tapped into that network to, again, call on them to raise funds and subscriptions to aid in the endeavor to establish a female seminary in Greece. And perhaps her most famous student was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who in her diary, again, wrote that I well remember her efforts in my second year to interest us in a school for girls in Athens, which she was helping Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe to found. These broader interests of the head of the school appealed keenly to my imagination and undoubtedly helped to widen my sympathies. So even though Willard herself did not champion, at least outwardly, traditional women's causes like suffrage, what she did do was help to inspire the next generation and then subsequent generations of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton to pick up the ball and to continue, again, a movement that she started to uplift, again, women, not just here in the United States, but there's also, again, later in the 19th century, there's also talk of that by liberating and uplifting Greek women, that it would set off a domino effect, if you will, that it would lead to the uplifting of women in the remaining Ottoman Empire, and even in places like Bulgaria and other parts of Eastern Europe. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Repousis. That was wonderful. I think we all have so much to learn from American history, which is Hellenic history. And I think, Lou, you do a great job in bringing this to us. Lou, I can't thank you enough for teaching us our Hellenic and American history, the effects that the Greek Revolution had on women, and how women were impacted and were able to progress here in this country out of their philanthropy and their intervention in Greece. Would either of you, or would anyone like to jump in and say, what are the best stories that we can share with our audience about the work of Greek American women or Philhellenic women and their sisters in Greece? What are some of the most important stories?
Just with you saying that, the first thing that comes to my mind is a story that was told by a missionary. I think his name is Jonas King. Travels to Greece still while the revolution was going on, and he comes to this village, and I can't remember the name of the village. It was a small village, and I mean, he notes that because when he arrives, first of all, the villagers were excited that he was from the United States. They knew that the United States was supporting the revolution, but not only that, he's invited to all these sort of parties, and throughout the evening, there were these toasts given, and toasts are important, like showing your support for something, what have you. And according to King, the group went out of their way to note the efforts of American women in particular for their support for the revolution, for providing supplies, clothing, what have you. And again, according to King anyway, he says that they yelled free cheers for American women for 5 minutes straight. So, so the Greeks knew of support from the United States, but also in particular the female efforts. So I'm throwing in that anecdote.
That's a wonderful story. The Grecian ladies of America were well recognized in Greece. So obviously we know today the Philhellenic movement had a tremendous impact in American civic life. And from an American history perspective, do you think that the Greek virtues and values of democracy are part of today's American rhetoric in terms of our policy? Or what is the effect of American intervention? Would you say it's a humanitarian, or is it a classical Greek motivation?
Yeah, I can maybe speak a little bit about this. In my work on the Philadelphia Greek Committee, in the 1820s, it kind of underwent two stages. The first stage in 1823, 1824, there was a effort or design to actually help or aid the revolutionaries directly themselves. And so they were talking about, sending aid to the Greek government, and at least in Philadelphia's case, there was, particularly among the Quaker sect, there was lukewarm interest at best. Philadelphia had a long tradition as being a pacifist city in its Quaker tradition. And so Philadelphia hoped to kind of get around that by having two sets of books, where one set would actually go to help the revolutionaries, and another book would go to help private distress. And by the time we get to the 1827, 1828, towards the end of the revolution, the effort kind of shifts to a more humanitarian enterprise. And so in the addresses given by the Philadelphia Greek Committee and Matthew Carey, who now becomes chairman, replacing Bishop William White, who is the head of the Episcopal Church, they make a point to say, hey, we're not appealing to you on behalf of, again, ancient Greek recollections and the ancient Greek heroes. We're not appealing on behalf of the Themistocles and that group. We're here intent on uplifting and helping to aid the distressed civilian population. And what was interesting in that campaign was that it had a much broader appeal. I found actually references where you would have small donations that were given by various counties across the state. And obscure groups, including mechanics and small farmers and people who probably you wouldn't expect to have been exposed to a classical education, but they could sympathize with, again, the plight of the civilian population who were suffering from distress and homelessness and so forth. And Samuel Gridley Howe, who was one of the leading Philhellenes, who was one of these American Lafayettes who could go to Greece, and he actually became a surgeon in the Greek army, and he was given the nickname of, Excellency. And there was others like Jonathan P. Miller, who was the Yankee Daredevil, was one of his nicknames. And both of these men ended up just helping to distribute the relief supplies to needy civilians. And so you do see kind of a shift to a more humanitarian effort. And this represented the first large-scale overseas humanitarian effort in American history. This was an age, there's no American Red Cross or International Red Cross during this period. So anytime there was an emergency, Americans would form these voluntary societies or these ad hoc committees for that specific purpose. And then once the purpose had been fulfilled, then they would cease operations. And so what was significant was how you were able to have a national network that drew on some of the reform campaigns of the era. So the Greek Revolution came in this midst of this intense period of association building for a host of worthy causes. And several of the leaders, like Matthew Carey was an Irish immigrant who had emigrated from Ireland during that country's revolution in the 1790s. And so he had a particular kinship with Greeks who were attempting to also liberate themselves from an imperialistic power. And he was also involved in many other humanitarian crusades, including to uplift the poor in Philadelphia. And so they were naturally drawn to these other causes. So it's not surprising that they would also, many of the women who were involved, whether it be even their students, would later be involved in the feminist movement and then later the abolitionist movement, because it fit into that larger pattern of benevolence.
I could just add to that too, because in my research, because your question asked also about intervention and whatnot, and in my research, it became almost very difficult to discern the reason for the shift, because there also was this effort on the part of the United States to downplay the efforts at public support for the army, because they were actively trying to facilitate a negotiation for a commercial treaty with the Ottomans. And they knew that if it was, when they actually were already doing damage control, the Sultan was very much aware that the American people supported the Greek Revolution, and their secret agent wrote to John Quincy Adams and President Monroe stating, if we could direct this more towards aiding civilians, that might go over better than this direct aid to the army. So it seems like it came from two different directions. There's certainly this effort at, trying to bring in more people to raise funds. There also is this government.
New England merchants in particular, Thomas Perkins, for one, actually lobbied with John Quincy Adams, who was from Massachusetts, and to kind of dissuade him from, sending over a chest full of money, to the Greeks. And there were also others that actually I came across, other letters written to the Philadelphia the treasurer of the Philadelphia Committee. For that same reason,
there was also a committee formed, quite frankly, and there was absolutely a discussion within the Congress among many people to actually physically support the revolution in Greece. But as you indicated, there was a shift politically, in particular as it came from the mercantile interests who were at that time and before, quite frankly, in the late 1700s. Who were trading with the Ottoman Empire, obviously, and that had to do, to a certain degree, also with the Barbary Wars and all the rest of that. But you mentioned Perkins. One of the big trade issues that he had to do with the opium trade, and in fact, buying cheap opium, which was quite frankly, in a tremendous, how should I put this, enlightenment within China itself. They love the Turkish opium, and he was able to buy opium in a very cheap basis and sell it to China very expensively. He and the Brahmins, as you know, as both of you know, actually, because you, Maureen, you also had it in your book. In fact, the Brahmins, etc., they influenced American politics, and that committee that we talked about that was formed to actually go and support, physical support of the revolution, all of a sudden died out. It became quiet, and as you both know, that was also the they used as an excuse, quite frankly, of the Monroe Doctrine. In other words, to avoid actually armed support of Greece.
Yeah, it even goes back earlier to that. I would add Washington's farewell address against entangling alliances and establishing the policy of non-intervention in European affairs. And it's interesting, there's actually an exchange of letters between Aramatios Gorais and Thomas Jefferson. Both men became acquainted with one another during the French Revolution when Jefferson was the U.S. minister there. And in Jefferson, and Gorais here is actually asking Jefferson to help sway public opinion in favor of the Greek cause, and even to send what he refers to as these agents who would help lead the Greeks into the correct path. And Jefferson responds by literally quoting Washington's Great Rule, which by that point had become sort of kind of fundamental, and later Monroe also basically kind of taps into that in the Monroe Doctrine, this policy of non-intervention, or the policy of the separate spheres, where leave Europe to the Europeans and the Americas to the Americans. So there's a lot of kind of like backdealing going on in Congress, and you have Daniel Webster, who gave this very passionate speech in favor of the Greeks, and you have Joel Roberts Poinsett, who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House, who is working together with John Quincy Adams to basically strike down Webster's motion to establish a commissioner in Greece. And then also, what's also interesting is that in 1825, Lafayette comes back to the United States. And by that point, interest in the Greek cause has kind of been dwindling. And he himself, he's there to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. But what he also does is he actually rekindles interest in the Greek Revolution. And then again, in 1826, so during the 50-year anniversary, Matthew Carey in Philadelphia begins, towards the end of that year, begins a new campaign for relief.
And then you had the rock star. You had the rock star, Lord Byron. When he came on board, everything flipped. If we can we go back to the Greek slave just for a second for the audience? They may not understand the power of that particular statue and the reality of that statue, because most people are not aware that the battles in that particular time are not like the battles of today, where somebody gave up and they were taken prisoner and all the rest of that. But what took place in that particular time is when the battle took place and there was a defeat, every male would be killed. There would not be any male left. So in fact, the women and the children up to a certain age became slaves, and they were sold in the slave market. So the concept of the Greek slave, which was a powerful statue, let's say, within that particular time, was an absolute reality of the Hellenic Revolution. Slavery was a big deal, in particular with women. They never talk about male slaves because they were killed. So there was only the woman and the children below a certain age. Maureen, would you like to talk about that just a little bit again?
Really briefly, for those who have not seen a a version of the statue, and there actually are several copies. One is with the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. But what you don't see when you look at this image is the detail that Hiram Powers has put into it to call attention to the fact that she is a Christian in particular. Where her hands are, there is actually well, you can almost make it out. Just if you follow the line below her thumb, she has a cross, there's a necklace denoting that she is Christian. We also have to assume from how she's depicted here that she's a Greek maiden, she's unmarried, about, of course, to meet her fate with whoever is going to purchase her. And so it's just it was meant to bring a lot of emotion to those who saw it. And again, you have to remember that art museums were not common in the United States, and certainly not classically inspired nude statues. This was the first nude statue to be put on display in the United States, and it was not considered to be taboo for a general audience to view it. So women and children viewed this statue, and the reason why it was considered to be socially acceptable. And again, we have to remember American society in the 1820s was very conservative. It was acceptable because of the subject matter, that this young woman is unwillingly nude, and the fate that she's about to encounter, the fact that she's Christian. So the subject matter really has to be understood. It's not just this random nude statue.
Angelo, I apologize for cutting you off with regards to Byron.
I just want to add that at the time, also during the 1820s, Americans were also, they read about the massacre at Chios, and you had the paintings of Delacroix, who was a French artist. There's also one of Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi, which shows a bare-breasted Greek maiden. And so these images, again, so it's not just here in the United States, but also Philhellenism across Europe as well. And Americans were aware of, again, and also what happened to the Suliot women, again, as well. Americans had read about these incidents and these events and these atrocities, and they were depicted in very lurid detail in the press particularly in 1822, 1823.
In terms of the woman, the American woman, and the movement of the suffrage movement, there were two basic groups, if I'm not mistaken. And when we did the image, for this particular event, we had Susan B. Anthony facing Elizabeth Stanton, which really represented one philosophical aspect, and then we had Julia Ward Howe facing Lucy Stone. Now, there was a difference between these two groups that formed their own groups, actually, and then combined later in history. Can we go over that in terms of the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement, and how some people said, hey, hold it, let's first take care of abolition, then we'll deal with the women's movement, whereas others said, hey, hold it, let's deal with them together right now. Can someone talk to that?
I mean, the division happens a little later. This is in conversation with the Civil War amendments,
Yes.
Giving the right to vote to African-American men. The conversation while that's happening is, why don't we have the amendment state that all citizens, men and women then, should have the right to vote? And ultimately the conversation then was, that's too much too fast. Let's wait on the women. To give women the right to vote was considered to be extremely radical for the time. And again, we have to remember that American society of the 19th century was very conservative. And so they ultimately, the argument was, we're not going to get this amendment to pass if we try to do it all at once. So let's get African-American men the vote first, and obviously votes for women will follow. Of course, as the critics of this point out, it's going to take a long time, and most of these women, of course, do not live to see a suffrage for women. So there is a division at that point where within the the suffrage movement, those who accept that decision. And I can't remember, I'm totally, has flown from my head. The NASA National, I can't remember, but there are two different women's suffrage groups that emerged from that. Those who supported the amendment as is, accepting suffrage would come later, and those who just thought that was a bunch of garbage and thought that
but what was interesting is that the split, that they had from, let's say, you're right after the Civil War, they combined again. Okay, the two organizations merged eventually in around, I think, 1890, if I'm not mistaken, to form then the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So these were two separate, very strong groups, obviously, and exactly what you said. That they said, hey, hold it, let's take care of one issue before we go into the other issue. Even though one group wanted to do both at the same time, which included Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth, Stanton. So this is a fascinating aspect of history, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
They do. I mean, obviously there's crossover. I do believe that there continued to be division within the suffrage movement all the way up to the moment of the amendment. Like Alice Paul continued to battle, I think it was NASA, that they just, or NASA, excuse me, that they just had conflicting interests, how radical to be, equal or suffrage versus equal rights. So.
Angelo, you had mentioned in a lot of your works, in particular the one on Philadelphia, and you had outlined actually numerous ships that went into Greece to bring supplies that was mentioned earlier by Maureen, in particular, clothes and things, food and things of that nature. And in some cases it became complicated. For example, the USS Constitution, which was a military ship, snuck into Greece, actually, and dropped off some supplies. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
The various Greek committees sponsored 8 such cargo ships. And there were various difficulties. The first one that the Philadelphia committee sent out, the Tontine, was actually seized by the Greek government. And they ended up selling the cargo for a mere pittance of what it was actually worth. And none of the 8 actually went to those that it were intended. The agent who was sent out by the committee was instructed to confer with Jonathan Miller, who was one of the, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, one of the Philhellenes who was, had volunteered. And the ship arrived before Miller was able to get there. And it was appropriated by the Greek authorities. Samuel Howe also in his letters also talked about the difficulty of trying to keep the aid from the soldiery. And so Edward Everett, who had been in correspondence with Howe, by this point Everett is now a senator from Massachusetts, and he uses his influence to actually get the Navy to send the Constitution to Greece. And the captain of the ship, Old Ironsides, his nickname, dating back to the War of 1812, Captain Patterson sends a strongly worded note to the Greek authorities that these cargo ships are under, again, U.S. protection, so don't mess with them, basically. So the government does actually, again, intervene here, and it's largely because of Everett's efforts that they were able to secure the remaining cargo ships, and then they were able to distribute the aid to the civilians. And Howe himself actually established, I think, 2 colonies in Greece to hopefully help them make them self-sustaining, so that they wouldn't just give them the aid and then just leave, but then they would kind of create a colony and conditions by which the people who would get relief would be self-sustaining, and so that the relief would continue in subsequent years.
Getting back to Marina's point when she was talking about the Greek committees and the influence of women within those committees, the reality is Everett didn't care for any of the other causes, quite frankly, women's rights and the abolitionism and all the rest of that. Marina, you want to just go into that a little bit? Because in fact, Everett loved the fact that there were women around, they were doing all the tasks, they were doing all the jobs. And in effect, that was what caused the multi-generational aspect that Maureen talked about in terms of women working to help other women. And obviously they were against slavery and all the rest of that, plus their children who were helping in making those clothes, etc., that would be supplied into Greece. This created an effect, that we're talking about today that was, tremendous. Marina?
The activism of the women was actually encouraged by Matthew Carey. If I'm correct, if I'm not correct, correct me, but I think Matthew Carey realized that he needed to involve women in fundraising, in responding to the needs, and there was a communication cross-Atlantically. Women were writing to each other. They were helping each other. They were involved. And I think that involvement really led then to the female reform movements going to the next generation. It's interesting that it's 100 years from the 1820s to the 1920s. It took women, the organizing, the massive civic participation, which was actually, I think, due to the cult of pure womanhood or true womanhood, women were not considered to be involved in politics, but the acceptance of women in charity, in philanthropy, in religious groups encouraged then that public role. And I think, Maureen, you might be able to speak to this specifically, how women emerged from their private sphere to depart from that retired circle into the public life that we enjoy today.
Yeah, as I noted in my talk, and it's also in my book extensively, the where women were able to be involved in the community had to do with things that would be considered appropriate for the so-called domestic sphere. So aiding destitute mothers, orphans, that sort of thing. But what's interesting is that women, and perhaps there's evidence that women knowingly did this, but I think that in other ways it happened organically. But as they continued to expand who they would help. And so the Greek Revolution, of course, is an extension of this phenomenon. They're called benevolent societies. That Greek women are extension of their concern within the domestic sphere. But in so doing, they in effect keep expanding their borders to be in the public sphere, but they're making the argument, oh, no, it still counts as the domestic sphere because this concerns women, the destitute, the poor, mothers, etc. But it definitely, over the decades, it continued to allow them to speak on more issues. So like I mentioned, Lucy Stone, for example, she begins as an abolitionist, and she sees the Greek slave, and she is, according to her, struck by this statue. And she decides, I'm going to start talking about women's rights issues. In fact, she was criticized for it. We have you come here to talk about abolitionism. And she goes, listen, if you want me, I'm going to talk about both. So deal with it. But yeah, so we definitely see this, that the borders of the women's sphere expands, and the Greek Revolution does play a part in that.
Maureen, let me ask you another question. There's that famous, obviously, international abolitionist conference that took place in London, which Jonathan Miller had gone to, and there was discussions, obviously, in the United States about that. And the fact that they did not want women at the conference. As a matter of fact, those women that went, they had them sit up in the balconies. And that particular event ticked off a lot of the women, didn't it? Didn't it, in effect, cause them to say, like, what's happening over here? Wasn't that part of it? Wasn't that part of what took place?
There is evidence, primary source material to show that women, the abolitionist movement, and again, we have to understand the abolitionist movement was considered radical in its time, but there were women who considered to be a part of that domestic sphere, aiding the downtrodden slave, right? So they're involved in that cause. And, again, like Lucy Stone, they're involving themselves in that cause, and they realize, oh, this isn't that hard of an intellectual leap to realize that women should also be, gaining more rights. So, and obviously the status of woman was not exactly the same as the status of a slave, but they couldn't help but see links.
What was also interesting is a lot of the orphans who came over and some of the refugees that came over, not only were they abolitionists, but they also were part of supporting women's rights, if I'm not mistaken. We had, for example, Vlachos, John Vlachos, who was actually supported by Samuel Gridley Howe, who in fact not only was an abolitionist himself, but he also supported women's rights. So it was an issue, quite frankly, that many of the abolitionists took up, except there was that divide, as you said, with regards to abolitionism versus women's rights. And they said, hey, hold it, maybe we're going too far. We can't do it right now. Let's do this first and do the other one second.
Right, because you have to remember with the constitutional amendment, you have to get, the states on board with it. They didn't want it to die. And then the group of women who were just like, well, we want it all or nothing, like this is what we're fighting for. So yeah, it understandably led to a divide.
Can you speak also to the correspondence between these American women and women in Greece at the time? Because I think you did mention it in your book, if I'm not mistaken, that there was a lot of correspondence, and therefore there was a mutual attraction for the downtrodden in Greece, which affected the American, women's minds, I think.
Well, and perhaps Angelo can speak more on this. I did come across, Greek women, and actually these letters were printed in newspapers, so they became public, where Greek women were writing and saying, this is the situation on the ground. Thank you so much for your assistance. If you could continue aiding us in this way, please do. So there definitely was a cross communication, but perhaps Angelo knows more about.
Yeah, there's an instance where Willard actually cites one of these letters in one of her addresses, and of course they also published. I mean, the women had a very powerful ally in Sarah Josepha Hale, who was the editor of the American Ladies magazine. And so during 1833-34, there wasn't a single issue that was published that didn't have some mention about Willard's plan. And she would publish not only the addresses by Phelps and Willard, but also letters by the missionaries, Francis Hill and others. And they would sometimes include within the address, within the letters, quotations or letters from their Greek sisters. And again, in a prevailing theme is that they talk about, again, the vilest slavery and so making that connection between enslavement of the Greek sisters and making that leap to their own status and condition here in America was not lost. And I think one of the things we have to remember is that, again, given the time period, particularly again when I'm writing in the early 1830s, it wasn't it was considered radical for a woman to even give an address publicly. And so Willard had to contend with critics who would label her unwomanly. Not only would they, compare her to Helen of Troy or Aspasia, but even, her American contemporaries like Wollstone or like Frances Wright or even Mary Wollstonecraft as being these radical, again, women who overstepped their boundaries. And so she had to kind of rein it in a little bit to because she also needed support for this plan. She needed male support. It wasn't just women who were going to raise funds, but they also needed, men to also, fit the bill, so to speak. And so she had to kind of tread a very fine line with not appearing to be too radical. She didn't openly champion, the traditional women's causes like suffrage that some of her later contemporaries did. But yet you do see instances where there is this veiled critique by bringing up, again, the Trojan Andromache, who was enslaved by the Greeks during the Trojan War. getting into Lou's point when he talked about, again, when the Greeks were, Greek men would be killed, and then the women and children would be, again, sold into slavery. So here's a classical reference to that. And I think given the reverence that Americans, particularly again, American Philhellenes, like including Edward Everett and Nicholas Biddle here in Philadelphia, who was the president of the Second Bank, and he was actually the second American to ever visit Greece in 1806, 1807 on his grand tour after he graduated from Princeton. And so there's this idea that we're recreating Athens here in America. Philadelphia was nicknamed, as was Boston. They kind of vied with each other who's going to be, had the moniker of the Athens of America. And here, at various instances, these women, particularly in the Phelps address, she's saying that, hey, that again, ancient Greek society wasn't all that great because it left out women. And if we are going to build a greater Hellas or a brighter Hellas here, and there was this kind of this sense that Americans were picking up the mantle of the ancient Greeks, that civilization has been marching ever westward since ancient times, and now it had crossed over to the Atlantic to America as so this ideas of American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, if you will, and so and Phelps is saying that to really truly be great, we also cannot forget again the women, and so their version of a brighter Hellas would include women, and I think by critiquing again classical Greek society this way, they're also providing kind of a veiled critique of American society. Says, hey, this is the society that you're venerating, but yet it was a society that didn't include women as equal participants in the polity. And we endeavor to again correct that oversight. But again, it's I think it's important to recognize that they can't come out openly. So their feminism had to be muted to a degree. And again, in using these veiled critiques was one way in which they can kind of get their message across, but also to at least give the impression publicly that they're not overstepping their bounds, and that, as Willard wrote, we're still leaning on the stronger sex in this project, but clearly behind the scenes, again, she cannot be more explicit in her feminism. But again, she recognized that American society at the time was not ready for a more radical, if you will, voice.
Can I ask you both a question? We talked about Aspasia, we talked about Helen. Why didn't anyone, I'm just curious, why didn't anyone bring, for example, up Hypatia or Hypatia, I guess is the way she's pronounced, that phenomenal philosopher, mathematician, etc., who excelled above all men within Alexandria? Why weren't those examples brought up? Or again, it related to how women were portrayed or how they felt. Yeah, there
was a lot of literature at the time. I mean, I haven't something that I think I might be worthy to pursue, but I haven't actually fully delved into it. But as someone who teaches on the early republic in America during the Age of Revolutions, you do see these references. I mean, again, during the constitutional debates, they would use pen names or pseudonyms, again, hearkening back to references to classical Rome and Greece. By the time we get to the 1820s, with Periclean democracy, so it's Aspasia's connection to Pericles, perhaps, that here was a woman who was liberated, educated. During the Revolutionary War in 1769, or during the Revolutionary era, there was actually a woman who wrote, who's Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, who wrote under the pen name of Aspasia to actually argue that bold, learned women made better wives. And so this was again, so these tropes or these themes go back much earlier than this period. So Willard and Phelps are kind of drawing from a longer history or tradition, again, in referencing these pseudonyms, if you will, or these classical Greek figures. Now there might be times when they reference other Greek women. But it's also, again, the perception as well. For one of the things I found very funny or ironic was that Willard succeeded in her effort to found a school And there were several attempts made by men to establish a male seminary on the Acropolis, and none of those succeeded, at least not until the late 19th century. And that's something that I think kind of irked many of her male contemporaries, that the one was like, what business does a woman have to try to, again, establish a school here in Greece? And so, and I think that was one of her success was a way to kind of stick it to those again, male contemporaries. So I found that story pretty funny, that she succeeded while they failed.
I think Aspasia or Aspasia is problematic as well, because she wasn't an Athenian citizen. She was a medic. She was
a medic, yeah.
a courtesan, right? And so, you know, if you're not a citizen of Athens, you can't have citizen children, although that was extended to their children, sort of as like an honorary thing. But so she's not, American society wouldn't have necessarily considered her to be a, how can I put this? A wholly like wholesome individual. She would be tainted in America. I mean, she would effectively would have been sort of perceived as
How about Hypatia? How would they view her? You know, the philosopher. You know, the head of the school of Alexandria at the time.
Yeah, again, going with Angelo. I mean, I have not read specifically anything like would talk about it, but my sense would be that that's a little too outside of the box for society.
But
like
the virtuous character that Emma Willard.
I think that's important. Aspasia is, being a courtesan would be considered to be unvirtuous, and the importance that they placed on Republican virtue, character. That these Republican mothers, their role was to, again, raise good Republican citizens, and so so I think it's very significant that, again, that they're trying to paint Willard as being unvirtuous, as being a woman who is motivated by ambition, and the classical definition of virtue was, the idea was, putting the good of the state above, again, your own personal ambitions, or and so, again, George Washington, of course, was considered the epitome of Republican virtue, the modern day Cincinnatus, if you will. So Willard had to try to counteract those images of her as being motivated by ambition and prone to fulsome adulation. I think, as one critic referred to her character.
Well, you're certainly right about Washington. I mean, they had Boumidi's Capitol mural in terms of the apotheosis of Washington, as being like a demigod. Marina, would you like to ask a couple of other questions, and we'll wrap it up?
Well, I'm curious about the participation and the rhetoric. And today, what is the Philhellenic rhetoric? Are there remnants of this rhetoric that we need to rescue for the future? And I think it's an important subject, because so much of classical Greece and the American Revolution, these are the roots of virtuous America, American ideals, American democracy. And I would like to talk about that a little bit. What is the classical inheritance that we have today?
I mean, I think in our moment where we're so divided, both sides have sort of taken it as their own and use similar, icons or historical references for very different arguments. I mean, we unfortunately, most recently, like January 6th, we have a lot of rioters who made reference to the Spartan 300, and they have the Moulin Lave mantra, and what exactly does that mean? I think that their understanding of what that means versus the historical meaning of that versus perhaps another group of Americans, how they would interpret it, means different things.
Well, I know that the classics are in some ways, essential for us to really understand our freedom and our democracy. And that's what we're celebrating when we celebrate the Greek Revolution and the women's suffrage centennial, in that we participate and we vote, we show up. And I think that in looking at this story, it's one of participation. And today we can talk about how do we participate in our democracy, and how do we then ensure that it will continue to live up to these classical ideals of democracy that we inherit as Greek Americans and as Americans.
Yeah, and the founders, they were well versed in the classics. Jefferson could actually read ancient Greek, and he translated ancient Greek text. And so, yeah, the idea of virtue, putting the good of the country above, partisanship, or something that's the theme in Washington's farewell address, where he warns against partisanship. The idea of putting, again, the country, the interests of the state as a whole, sacrificing for the common good rather than for your own personal individualistic ambitions or interests.
So Lou, does anyone have any closing remarks?
Well, mine is not a closing remarks, and I'll let people make their closing remarks. All I have to say is this is a fascinating discussion. Maureen.
I think it looks like we have more to research and write. I'll conclude with that.
Angelo?
Yeah, I would just concur with Maureen. There's just several different avenues that we can pursue, and the connections with the feminist movement and the abolitionist movement, I think, still need to be explored. Just looking over some of my notes, the references during the 1850s, comparing, again, women's lack of the right to vote with what's happening in places like Kansas during the Civil War there, and then in the late 19th century as well, and then even harkening back to the Greek Revolution. So I think there's still some very interesting topics that need further exploration. I'll just say that.
Marina, some closing remarks on your end?
Well, I wanted to remember Julia Ward Howe and Samuel Gridley Howe, and how that marriage was so involved with Greece. And really, I think the efforts of Samuel Gridley Howe he was the star of the family. And then Julia Ward Howe then overtook his fame, and she eclipsed him by her efforts. Maybe we should just remember Julia Ward Howe today.
I think it's an amazing discussion. Maybe part of another panel discussion. How you're right. How he was the superstar of the age, and there were issues between them, obviously, because he didn't care for her writing and being out there as a woman. And then all of a sudden, as time goes on, she becomes a superstar, which is again very fascinating.
Yeah, and they both returned to Greece in the 1860s during the Crete insurrection. I actually have a chapter in my book about that. So shameless plug there.
Not only her, but also her children, their children.
Yeah, their daughter actually married one of the Greek missionaries there, and he comes back together with them, and they help found the Perkins School.
Yeah, Perkins, the person we talked about with the heroin trade.
Yeah.
This is all like very fascinating and interesting. I'd like to thank all of you, both of you, certainly, for a fantastic panel discussion. And you're correct, Maureen and Angelo, the fact that there's so much more that there is to learn and to research and to write about. And that really was what we were talking about in terms of having this discussion to begin with, because number one, we want to educate the people who are listening to this panel discussion on some of the issues that were brought up, but also to make everyone understand that there's, the history is not necessarily totally written. There's a lot to be analyzed. There's a lot to be researched, and a lot to write about. And I hope you two, I'm looking at you two, I hope you two basically take over that task, and we can certainly get together and discuss your other books and research that you'll be doing. I am happy that when we had our last panel discussion, Maureen, you had just come out with your book. I think it was the same week, and you've done a fantastic job, by the way, in terms of various lectures around the topic, and you're certainly adding to a lot relating to the 200th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. And certainly, Angelo, your writings and works are in most bibliographies relating to the Hellenic Revolution, and you should take great pride in that. To the audience, we are, and to Angelo's point, actually, he brought up architecture. So we are going to do an event on June the 13th on revival architecture in the age of revolution. So in this particular panel discussion, we'll have a well-known architect in America, a well-known architect in Greece, and the architect in America will discuss all the classical architecture and things of that nature that related to Angelo's point earlier. And the Hellenic professor from the University of Thessaloniki will discuss the architecture post the Hellenic Revolution. In other words, the classical architecture or the revival architecture from the ancient period. For our audience, again, if you want to learn more about our events coming up, you go on the internet to EMBCA.com. To our friends, because I am the chairman of the AHEPA Hellenic Cultural Commission, to our friends from AHEPA, please, and to those who are not members of AHEPA, please go on the internet to ahepa.org. They're very strong on defending Hellenism, and I think it's important in particular, in this particular age, that we do defend Hellenism. Hellenism is not about Greece, it's about the concept of Hellenism that we've been talking about that affected, obviously, not only Hellenic history, but also American history. So when we talk about the Hellenic Revolution, we're also talking about American history. It's not only Greek history. We are going to have another panel discussion later in the week on doing business in Greece. It's the second part because the first part that we had was so popular that, in fact, we decided to do another panel discussion on doing business in Greece, and that will be on Thursday, May 27th at 12 p.m. All our events are part of the reason why we do it on Sunday is so we can have an audience both in the United States and also in Europe and Greece, obviously. I'd like to thank all of you, to the panelists, certainly to Marina for her excellent moderating in this particular panel and for her passion in this particular topic. So thank you all, and until later in the week. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.